Donnelly case became a quiet turning point. States began to look more closely at marriage laws. Physicians spoke with renewed caution about inherited conditions. The concept of purity, once uttered earnestly in certain intellectual circles, became tainted by association with the valley's graves. And slowly, a new ethic emerged, one rooted not in control, but in care. The homestead itself stood for years after the last Donnelly died. The wind crept through the boards. Birds nested where children once slept. The journals, preserved by Brennan and later archived far from Montana, outlived the cabin. The valley returned to the bears and the snowfall, but the memory of what happened there lingered, not as a spectacle, but as a whispered annotation in the darker margins of American history. The tragedy offered a lesson more enduring than any legal verdict, that the pursuit of perfection, when divorced from compassion, inevitably leads to ruin. The Donnellys believed they were improving themselves. Instead, they built a lineage shaped by fear, secrecy, and suffering. Their story stood as a stark reminder that when families turn inward too far, when isolation replaces community, when belief hardens into doctrine, the line between tradition and atrocity can vanish without trace. Those who later visited the valley reported a strange hush, as though the land itself remembered. Some said the wind through the pines sounded like murmured lullabies, or like the soft weeping of a woman too exhausted to cry aloud. Others found nothing unusual at all, just snow, silence, and the scattered remains of a cabin swallowed by time. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. The Donnelly story endures because it touches a deeper fear, that knowledge without wisdom can become cruelty, that families can lose themselves in their own myths, and that the wilderness, for all its beauty, can hide practices that thrive only in the absence of witness. As the decades passed, historians debated whether everything had truly been uncovered. Brennan himself believed there were missing pages, families who shared blood with the Donnellys, but escaped documentation, traditions that survived quietly in distant hills. He wrote near the end of his life that the family's practices were not an anomaly, but a symptom of something broader: the human desire to control what should be accepted and to shape what should be loved as it is. The last lines of his journal, written in a trembling hand, speak with the weariness of a man who had spent his life studying the boundary between science and suffering. Perfection is a ghost we chase until it consumes us. The Donnellys did not find purity. They found extinction. And if their story warns us of anything, it is that the worth of a life cannot be measured by the symmetry of its bones, nor by the neatness of blood. Whether the valley still holds traces of the family is unknown. Snow buries, time erodes, and memory grows faint. But the graves remain, leaning quietly in their row, reminders of a century-long experiment that cost everything and illuminated nothing, save the truth that the wilderness does not forgive the horrors carried into it. And so the story ends not with justice or revelation, but with a question that lingers in the cold air. How many other families, hidden by distance and silence, once followed similar paths never discovered, their secrets carried away by the wind? Perhaps we will never know. But the Donnelly legacy stands as a warning carved into the American frontier itself, a testament to how easily the pursuit of purity becomes a descent into darkness. If this tale left you uneasy, you are not alone. The valley is quiet now, but its echoes continue, whispering caution, reminding us that the darkest tragedies do not always come from monsters, but from ordinary people who believe they are doing what is necessary. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beneath snow and time, the story waits for whoever is willing to listen. Patrick and Bridge never stood before a jury. Patrick died first, his body giving out under the pressure of exposure and the collapse of a belief system that had governed his every decision. It happened in a quiet cell, far from the valley he had chosen as sanctuary. Bridge followed weeks later, her final pregnancy ending the way so many before it had, nature forcing an end where human determination had long refused to yield. By the time the child was delivered, lifeless and malformed, Bridge herself had nearly disappeared into her own frailty. The death took her swiftly, leaving behind the remnants of a woman hollowed by decades of ritual and fear. The surviving children were scattered as circumstances dictated. Seamus, the eldest, broke completely under questioning. His mind, already fragile, splintered under the pressure of speaking truths he had been trained since childhood never to voice. He fell into silence so profound that even the physicians in Helena could not reach him. Records note that he sat for hours unmoving, hands clasped, gaze fixed on nothing, as though waiting for a command he both feared and yearned for. Moira and Colleen were harder to assess. The girls, raised to see themselves as vessels for continuing the bloodline, had been shaped by a doctrine that stripped them of any identity beyond biology. Their eyes held a lostness that suggested they had never imagined futures of their own. Physicians wrote long notes filled with terms that no longer matter: hysteria, moral conditioning, inherited nervosities. But the truth was simpler. Both were victims of a belief system designed to devour them. Declan, the youngest, vanished before authorities could decide how to handle his case. One morning, the door to the small room where he slept stood ajar, snow drifting across the threshold. Tracks led only a short distance before the wind erased them. Whether he fled deliberately or wandered in confusion, whether some remnant of family training called him back into the mountains, or whether the wilderness claimed him without ceremony, none could say. The search lasted 3 days and then tapered off. Some believed he perished quickly. Others whispered he might still live in the high timber, shaped by the same isolation that had shaped all Donnellys before him. Dr. Brennan, meanwhile, found himself drawn into a role he had not sought, that of interpreter. The law needed explanations it could categorize, and he alone possessed the context to give shape to the family's history. He documented the graves, the journals, the genetic charts, and the systematic pattern of births and deaths. In measured prose, he translated horror into language that courts and medical boards could understand. His reports, printed in obscure medical newsletters, marked some of the earliest attempts to argue scientifically against close-kin marriages, and even then, he omitted far more than he revealed. What he left unpublished dwelled in his private journals. There, he abandoned the restraint he maintained in public. His handwriting grew jagged as he detailed the nightmares that plagued him, the fragile breathing of the conjoined twins, the clinical precision of the family notebooks, the extinguished eyes of children who had learned fear before language. He questioned himself repeatedly, how a man devoted to understanding heredity could stand inches from a family destroyed by its abuse, yet feel powerless to intervene until it was too late. He recorded one thought often, that the Donnelly experiment was not a relic of savagery, but of a misguided intellectual hunger. In Fergus Donnelly's early writings, he saw echoes of European theorists, men of laboratories and lecture halls who had never dirtied their hands, yet whispered seductively about improvement, purity, and breeding. Brennan knew those voices well. He had once listened to them himself. After the case dissolved and the homestead was abandoned, the valley returned to silence. The cabin sagged slowly under the weight of seasons. Snow claimed the roof. The garden collapsed into weeds. The small cemetery remained the clearest testament. 11 crosses listing in the wind, with space for more that would never come. Locals told stories in low tones, but the region was too remote, too inhospitable for curiosity to linger long. Still, the story traveled in fragments. A doctor's report in one publication, a territorial coroner's note in another. Researchers decades later would find mentions of a family in Pennsylvania with a similar pattern of births. County records in Ohio hinted at a case never filed. The Donnellys, it seemed, were not alone in their clandestine pursuit. In lonely pockets of America, where roads failed and winters held on until April, other families had wrestled with the same misguided belief that heredity was a mechanism to be managed, corrected, perfected. In the cramped heat of the cabin, Brennan tried medicine and counsel. He argued, pleaded, recorded. He threatened calls to federal deputies, an unthinkable act for a man who had previously hidden his own radical theories in Europe. He insisted the twins were living beings under law and that killing them would be murder. In the end, those interventions could not change biology. The twins lived 3 fragile days, their shared heart laboring beneath the hand of a man who had come to fix what decades of secrecy had already broken. Their deaths, quiet and final in the pre-dawn hours of Brennan's 3rd day, were the rupture the family could no longer contain. Where before, there had been a pattern of hidden graves and private verdicts, there would now be testimony, records, and official scrutiny. Brennan seized what he could: the journals, genealogical charts, the ledger of dates that proved a series rather than random misfortune. He counted 11 graves and documented their uniformity. He cataloged the family's histories and traced links across state lines. The material was damning. The legal machinery of the territory, for all its slowness, reacted. The Donnellys were taken into custody. Their homestead fell silent. But justice in that place and in that age moved unevenly. Patrick and Bridge would die in custody before a full trial could unspool. Patrick collapsed under what physicians later called a stroke. Bridge's final pregnancy ended in another malformed stillbirth that seemed a grim coda to the family's tragic experiment. The surviving children scattered, some to institutions, others to the wilderness. Declan vanished from custody one night, a small figure swallowed by the same mountains that had sheltered the family's deeds for so long. Brennan published fragments of his findings, clinical reports on the dangers of consanguineous marriage and the visible correlations between close inbreeding and increased congenital abnormalities. Yet he withheld much. His private journals, found only after his death, reveal the torment of a man who could not reconcile his role as doctor, as scientist, and as witness. He slept poorly, haunted by the sketches of infants and by his own impotence at turning back a history that was at once scientific curiosity and moral abomination. The Donnelly homestead was abandoned. The cemetery's neat rows became a local cautionary place. People passed them with lowered eyes. Over time, other cases surfaced in America's lonely corners. Families who had practiced cloistered customs that produced high infant mortality and hidden graves. The Donnellys did not stand alone, but their story became a touchstone, a grotesque lesson about the dangers of isolation, of pseudoscience dressed as tradition, and of what can happen when a belief in purification overrides the most elemental human obligation: care for one's offspring. In the years that followed, the Donnelly case fed broader changes. Stricter marriage laws, renewed attention to child welfare, and slowly, the beginnings of a medical consensus on heredity that would render such private experiments scientifically bankrupt. Yet the scars remained. The cemetery with its small crosses, the leather journals with their clinical cruelty, the children whose lives were ruined by a doctrine of purity. Brennan's notebooks close with repeated questions, more cry than analysis. How do we hold science to humanity? How do we stop theory from becoming tyranny when it's practiced behind closed doors? The mountains kept their secrets, but the ledger and the graves made one truth unavoidable. The pursuit of a perfected bloodline had birthed only suffering, deformity, and finally, the complete collapse of the family's design. If you have followed this far, the valley still holds echoes. The Donnellys' experiment ended in a silence that was less peace than exhaustion. What it left behind was not the triumph of any theory, but a map of what happens when belief, fear, and isolation intersect with a tristesse for which there is no prescription. What followed in the months after the Donnelly arrests was less a trial than a slow unraveling. The territorial authorities, unprepared for crimes whose roots stretched across generations and oceans, struggled to understand what exactly they had uncovered. Lawyers circled vague legal terms: infanticide, concealment, perversion of burial law, but none of these words could bear the full weight of what the mountains had kept hidden. In a territory where murders were often simple, sudden, and visible, this was something else entirely. A crime of lineage, repeated with meticulous intention. Behind the house, the little cemetery lay in rows like tally marks. 11 crosses stood in the snow-dark earth, dates carved with an even, practiced hand. Some bore dates from years past, others were fresh. The graves were precise, not the random scatter of frontier losses. Nearby, the soil had been disturbed where more plots were being prepared. The arrangement suggested a plan that extended into the future, and the thought of that premeditation made Brennan's stomach cold. Patrick Donnelly opened the door, a man who had aged too fast. His hair had gone white, his face mapped with lines of constant strain. He parried Brennan's professional questions with a practiced pause, hospitality wrapped in something taut and brittle. Bridge hovered behind him like a shadow, thinner now, tremors in her hands that could have been any number of things: malnutrition, neurosis, or the slow erosion of conscience. Inside, the cabin's interior betrayed a life organized around concealment. Curtains, locked doors, rooms partitioned not merely for privacy but for segregation. Spaces to hide what could not be shown. The children moved through those spaces with an economy of motion learned under pressure. Moira was visibly pregnant again. Colleen had matured in ways that suggested an unnatural acceleration of body. Declan's face carried a symmetry and a curvature to his spine. Seamus flinched at questions and stammered as if his own words could become transgressions. It was not merely the physical signs that suggested something amiss. It was the family's demeanor, an obedience that felt less like reverence than conditioning. When Brennan asked about births, Patrick's answers were curt, rehearsed. When Brennan's attention slipped across a table and landed on a leather-bound volume, Bridge's hand moved with the reflex of a keeper. She could not pull it away completely. Brennan's fingers brushed the books and opened pages into a ledger of sorrow. There, drawn with an unblinking technicality, were anatomical sketches: infants with missing limbs, cleft palates, malformed spines, each illustration accompanied by notes in English and Irish Gaelic. Dates marched across the margins for decades, The journals read like field notes from a perverse naturalist. Descriptions, assessments of survivability, comments on temperament, and, chillingly, evaluations of whether a child's life would degrade or enhance the family line. The entries made their thesis plain. The Donnellys believed themselves stewards of a bloodline, and over generations they had refined a breed. Genealogical charts tucked among the pages showed patterns of intermarriage, first cousins, second cousins, marriages arranged to concentrate particular traits. The practice did not read as happenstance but as strategy, an enhancement protocol, the books called it, a methodical attempt to accelerate desirable qualities while excising the rest. Brennan's medical education supplied a different diagnosis. He recognized in those pages the slow arithmetic of genetic burden. Recessive traits, harmless when scattered, had been concentrated like poison. The family's early successes, striking features, keen minds, had been the bright coin shown by breeding's double edge. For every admired trait, the ledger revealed a trade: more frequent deformities, mental fragility, unpredictable degeneration. The journals were not the crude notes of ignorant superstition. They were the careful records of a long experiment in human heredity, carried out without oversight, without consent, and without mercy. When Brennan confronted Patrick with the ledger, the patriarch did not rage or deny. He confessed with a voice like a man reading from a scripture he had helped write. His great-grandfather Fergus, the journals said, had read agricultural treatises and applied the logic of animal husbandry to people. Where cattle and horses were refined to breed speed or strength, Fergus believed humans could be similarly improved. He initiated a practice of arranged marriages and merciful releases, what his descendants called the release from earthly suffering. Over 5 generations, the ritual hardened into law. Bridget's words, when she finally spoke, were shaped by doctrine rather than remorse. "We spare them pain," she said, and it was clear she had told herself this almost as often as she had carried infants to the cold ground. "For the line," she repeated, and the phrase had the cadence of prayer. Brennan's horror was not simply moral, it was scientific. The Donnellys had not purified anything. Their experiment had concentrated deleterious alleles until the family itself became a crucible of pathology, each generation carrying more risk than the last. The conjoined twins born that summer were the experiment's culminating failure. 2 infants fused in ways beyond the era's capacity to remedy, a physiological impossibility the family had neither the means nor the right to indulge. When spring finally took its iron grip from the passes in March 1875, Harrison found the Donnelly cabin changed. New boards patched the walls. Fresh chinking filled gaps as if something violent had been repaired. The ground around the house showed frantic digging, and there was a smell, sickly, sweet, that Harrison, in his years on the mountains, knew too well as the scent of death and decay. Bridge, when she opened the door, was a different woman. 6 months had carved her narrow, hair streaked prematurely gray at the temples, hands trembling, eyes like hollows where something had died. The family was in the middle of a birth. Moira, 17, attended her mother with the surety of one who has performed this rite often. The infant came malformed, an S-curved spine, a hand malformed into a club, a skull oddly shaped. The child's breathing was labored but not absent. What Harrison remembered most vividly was not the infant's condition, but the family's reaction. A cold, practiced assessment where grief ought to have been. Patrick's voice, clipped in rapid Gaelic that Harrison did not understand, carried a protocol rather than panic. "The child won't survive the winter," he said in English. cadence steady as a verdict. It is mercy to spare the suffering. Harrison offered to fetch a doctor. Patrick refused with a hand that brooked no argument. "We handle our own," he said. "Some children are not meant for this world." 2 weeks later, Harrison returned with routine mail and found the infant gone. Bridge spoke of a burial next to the others and led him to a neat row of small wooden crosses behind the cabin. 4 graves, each too small for adults, dated within the past 8 months. The earth had been turned hastily, graves spaced as if planned, crosses cut to a uniform size, prepared, not improvised. Harrison's blood ran cold. All that summer, his monthly runs drew his attention inward, into the Donnelly yard. The children moved as though every gesture could be judged. Conversation, even in English, circled the same obsessions. Purity, strength, the sacrifices ancestors had made. Seamus flinched and stammered. Declan stared at the little graveyard as if seeing something else. Moira and Colleen bore themselves like older women, efficient, secretive. Harrison told his tale to the only physician he could reach in Helena. Dr. Theodore Brennan, newly arrived in October 1875, and carrying with him a library and training from Vienna, Berlin, Edinburgh. A man whose ideas about heredity unsettled respectable circles back in Europe. Brennan had come to Montana to bury a scandal and to keep working, in anonymity, on questions of blood and inheritance that had branded him persona non grata. When Harrison spoke of lights burning at odd hours, of songs that sounded wrong in the night, of figures moving in blizzard conditions as if against the weather, Brennan's curiosity quickened. But winter held the mountains in a prison of white. Even if he wished to go, the passes were closed. Travel suicidal, the trail a graveyard. The Donnellys had never asked for help before. For now, Brennan did the only thing he could. He opened records, cross-checked names, followed a paper trail that hinted the cabin in the valley was only one node in a far older network of secrecy. Brennan read like a man stalking a ghost. He followed passenger lists to New York, sifted through Ellis Island notations, and unearthed an immigration inspector's offhanded warning. A Donnelly family had been flagged for concerning physical features among their children and for evasive answers about family medical history. The inspector's suggestion that the family be held for further evaluation had been overridden, an administrative mercy in the rush of arrivals, and the Donnellys were processed and sent west. Brennan found mentions of other Donnellys in disparate counties, Pennsylvania, Ohio, each appearance shadowed by strange infant deaths or sudden departures. The pattern tightened like a noose, a family moving in fragments, leaving behind whispers and questions. When the mountain passes finally loosened in the spring of 1876, Brennan chose a direct course. He would see the valley for himself. The journey took a day of hard riding, tracks cut through dense timber, creek beds that could swallow a mule, slopes that tested the limits of endurance. The isolation pressed in. No other boots carved the trail. The cabin sat in a small clearing, an unremarkable silhouette against the ridge, its smoke thread thin and steady. To any casual eye, it might have seemed a successful frontier homestead. Brennan's eyes, trained to read bodies and books alike, saw the misalignments. In the winter of 1876, high in the lonely teeth of Montana's mountain range, a German physician named Theodore Brennan stumbled upon a truth that would not leave him. 23 miles from the nearest settlement, inside a cabin tucked where maps grew thin and rumor thick, he found papers that traced 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding within a single Irish family. That alone was a grim story, but beneath the floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden as one hides a sin, lay the preserved remains of 7 infants. Each bore the same grotesque markers, the same shared deformities, as if some cruel blueprint had been followed for a century. The Donnelly family had been choosing who should live and who should die, generation after generation, a private jurisprudence executed by their own hands. What Dr. Brennan would later record challenged everything the provincial medical world thought it knew about heredity and about the lengths a family might travel to protect a secret they believed sanctified. The evidence suggested this was not frontier madness sprung up overnight. It read instead like the continuation of a slow experiment, refined, ritualized, carried across an ocean and through the years until concealment became a craft. The thread of the Donnelly tragedy began, not in the raw snow of Montana, but in the soft green damp of County Cork, during a winter in 1798, when the first decisions were made and the first rules carved into family practice. By the time the family turned their faces west, the experiment had been rehearsed and rationalized into doctrine. Montana in 1874 sat at civilization's ragged edge. Helena, the territorial capital, held fewer than 8,000 souls, men and women gathered around mining claims, around the promise of metal. Beyond its sparse streets, the landscape was a mosaic of camps, homesteads, and native lands resisting settlement. Authority existed in fragments. Deputies rode when they could. Supply lines thinned across miles of wilderness, and winters closed like locked gates. It was the perfect soil for families who wished to disappear. Into that isolation came Patrick Donnelly and his wife Bridge, with 4 surviving children: Seamus, 19, Moira, 17, Colleen, 15, and Declan, barely 12, arriving at Helena in September 1874 aboard a freight wagon. Their crates suggested an uncommon prosperity. Patrick spoke as a man who'd known schooling, his hands stained not with soil, but with ink. Bridge spoke not at all. She moved as though danger clung to her skin, paid with gold, and counted each coin as if counting breaths. Their papers were immaculate. Residency in Brooklyn, employment, references. Yet those documents were lies crafted with an artisan's hand. They had fled County Cork after scandal. Father Michael O'Sullivan, a man of the cloth who had kept parish whispers private, had found something within the family he could not reconcile with faith. His final warning to Patrick, a clenched, trembling hand on paper, called what he had discovered an abomination and threatened excommunication and exposure to whatever civil authority would listen. The Donnellys left Ireland like shadows. Patrick purchased a parcel of 160 acres in a narrow valley, a place the territorial government sold cheaply to men with gold and no questions. The cabin sat hidden between steep ridges, reachable only by a trail that became impassable when snow laid its long hand across the passes. There was a spring that ran in summer and froze in winter. Smoke from the chimney could not be seen from any neighbor. It was the kind of seclusion the family needed, both refugee and crucible. They had prepared in ways that betrayed more than mere frontier thrift. The growing season lasted but 4 months. Their gardens and preserves suggested knowledge, planning, a mathematics of survival. They built a log house with thick walls and small windows, interior partitions that could be sealed against cold or curiosity. The craftsmanship hinted at previous experience with harsh climates, or at least counsel from hands that knew better. Neighbors noticed other things. The Donnellys resembled one another beyond the ordinary. Pale blue eyes, long fingers, angular faces. The children were unnaturally composed, old in their presence, precise in their movements, wary of strangers. Jake Harrison, the seasonal mail carrier whose path threaded every mountain clearing, overheard discussions that chilled him. Talk of maintaining the purity of the line, of proper breeding, of sacrifices for advancement. Words not born of frontier hunger, but of a darker inheritance.